Hello students, welcome to the Analyst dated 18th of August 2023. Today we look at 4 topics. The first will be regarding the Independence Day speech of our Honorable Prime Minister. Then we look at the Independence Day speech of our Honorable Chief Justice of India. Then we look at drug menace in Kashmir, and finally we'll look at Forest Rights Act 2006. Now, starting with the first topic. So, this pertains to your GS2, and the speech of the Prime Minister becomes extremely important. Why? Because it gives us insights into what are the broader themes. Then it also gives us a lot of fodder. Fodder for our prelims plus mains. Right? Then it also gives us the way forward. To say so, it is basically an address to the nation, and therefore we need to understand the key takeaways, that what is the vision going forward. So let's look at various themes. So the introduction started with the discussion on border villages. Now, Prime Minister gave this statement: the village on the border is not India's last village, it is the first village of the country. Now, this pertains to your balanced regional development as well as the ideas of Antyodaya. So not ignoring any region of India, not ignoring the border areas, not ignoring the border infrastructure. And every village, even the last mile connectivity, even the last person in the line, they all are equal, and therefore equal weightage through the vibrant village scheme. Then Prime Minister paid homage to the penance and sacrifice of our Puji Bapu, that is Gandhiji, as well as bravehearts like Bhagat Singh, Rajguru and Sukhdev. Then he talked about trust. When we are talking about trust, the trust between government and citizen. The trust that a citizen reposes on the government, that the government is going for right action, and the trust that government reposes on citizen. Let's say I am filing the income tax correctly, right? So trust has become core to governance. Then the trust on the bright future of this great nation. And then he congratulated the family of 140 crore Indians, the family of 140 crore individuals, to become the 5th largest economy of the world. He also gave the idea of Panch Pran. Now these are resolves, 5 resolves. So the first resolve is going for a developed India. Now as we entered 2022, that is when we achieved 75 years of independence, we entered into Amrit Kal. And so the next 25 years, going to the centenary celebrations in 2047, this period will be called Amrit Kal. And our resolve is to become a developed India by 2047. Most importantly, we have to remove any trace of colonial mindset. We have to break out of these shackles. The shackles of colonial mindset, the inferiority complex that is attached with the colonial history, and to come out of this slave mentality. And therefore, thereby we must take pride in our legacy, whether we are talking about food, we are talking about clothing, we are talking about culture, we are talking about religion. So all aspects of society we must celebrate. And therefore the ideas of Ek Bharat Shresth Bharat, the ideas of diversity, and somewhere down the line the ideas of unity in this diverse country. Then the idea of trust again, where the citizens are also abiding to their duties and they are lawful citizens. Now, what is the idea? Today, when we are looking at Amrit Kal, so the Prime Minister said that we are essentially building India for the next 1,000 years. And whatever we do, the actions we do, the steps we take, the sacrifices we make as a composite whole, as India, as all the states, as all the people contribute, they make sacrifices, they act, they do jobs. Somehow they contribute to the nation building. It is basically building the foundation for the next 1,000 years of Indic civilization and India. Then he was referring to people, and in a democracy people are central, they are at the core. So Sarvjan Hitaye, Sarvjan Sukhaye. So for the benefit of all and for the betterment, for the very better quality of life of all. So Sarvjan Hitaye, Sarvjan Sukhaye. Now all this fodder material you can use in your essay, ethics, in your GS 1, 2, 3, wherever such substance or such question of, let's say, social justice is referred to. Then he talked about three strengths that we have. The first is demography, second is democracy, third is diversity. When we are talking about demography, we are talking about an average age below 30. The youngest country, the youngest major country that we see. And total population going to 140 CR, 140 crore. So more than 60% of this population is below 30. That means we are looking at the cusp of demographic dividend, the opportunity of demographic dividend for the next 2 to 3 decades. Then talking about democracy, we the people at the core, the betterment of people at the core. And in democracy, there is voice and choice. And therefore, the alignment of government, the alignment of governance, the way we want to proceed will be finally judged by the people themselves. And therefore, democracies, even though they may be chaotic, but they sustain. And therefore, it is a sustainable model of governance. More so, we are extremely diverse. Whenever we are talking about, let's say, linguistic identities, we are talking about cultural identities, religious identity, caste-based identity. So we have multiple identities that reflect in our own personalities, in our regions, in our states. And this diversity becomes a source of strength by showing resilience. And that is why Indic civilization has continued for these thousands of years. Then he called this as the trinity of democracy, demography and diversity, which has potential to fulfill every dream of Indian in this Amrit Kal. Amrit Kal referring to the next 25 years. Then he emphasized on technology, how technology has become the fulcrum of today's society and how in the emerging times, technology will help us, it will guide us for a developed India. So he congratulated the innovation, the R&D ecosystem, the knowledge economy that has been created in the tier 2 and tier 3 cities. Now, innovation is not only situated in the top metropolitan cities. Innovation is not only coming from the startups which are operating in Bengaluru or the greater Mumbai region, greater Delhi NCR region, but it is also coming from tier 2 and tier 3 cities. And he also emphasized on the government policy of Atal Tinkering Labs and Atal Innovation Mission, which has instilled a innovation ecosystem and has created behavioral changes, not only in students but also parents. Now parents also push their wards towards more innovative ideas of career building. And therefore today more than 100 schools have Atal Tinkering Labs where they can go for satellites, which can be launched in the future. Then he was talking about how India has behaved with the globe, taking the presidency of G20 and promoting the ideas of the global south and the Indian value systems of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, going for an all-embracing approach, also looking at the needs which are unfulfilled, more particularly about the LDC countries, about the small island countries, the countries which are not represented in G20. Then during COVID, a lot of questions were raised on the capacity, on the governmental capacity of India. So the world, the commentators, the large business houses, the large news and publishing agencies like BBC, like Fox, they were telling that India has no capacity to deal with such a pandemic. But what happened? During COVID, we were able to provide 200 crore vaccine doses. And again, we were also able to help our nearby countries, our neighborhood, as well as the countries who needed such vaccination the most, like countries of Africa. So, regions where poverty was there, countries which could not afford vaccines. So, India came forward to help its neighborhood and the most needy. Then, post-COVID, the world was looking at issues issues like inflation, fuel prices, triggered by the Russia-Ukraine war. Then it was looking at an arms race. Then it was looking at slowdown, recession. But India must be proud that it has emerged as a global bright spot. And few days ago, we also discussed how the FPIs which left the country during COVID also, and recently in 2022 also, they are again tying up and lining up to again invest in our country. So the idea is that India is becoming an emerging power and a voice of global south, as well as a voice of the developing and emerging nations. And it is calling for a new global world order, the global world order which has changed after COVID, and it wants to get its true place, the place in accordance with its weight. Then the ideas of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is reflected in government's policies like one sun, one world, one grid, where the idea is to go for one grid when it comes to renewable energy, the idea of one earth, one health when it comes to holistic health, when it comes to sustainable development, when it comes to balancing the ideas of development with environmentalism. Then one world, one family, one future is the theme for G20, which India is the host for. Then the idea of lifestyle for environment. So going for the Indic way of living. Why? To solve the global crises, the global common problems of climate change as well as your global warming. Then the idea of International Solar Alliance. Why? To go for more funding towards renewable energy, to go for technology transfers between like-minded countries who are going towards renewable energy transition on a rapid pace. The Big Cat Alliance towards biodiversity conservation. Then CDRI, looking at the incessant rainfalls, looking at the increasing variability intensity of the extreme climate events, the ideas of coalition for a disaster risk resilient infrastructure. Then the idea of Sagar, security and growth for all. And this comes in the backdrop of disputes created by China in South China Sea. And the string of pearls and the bulldozing of its neighbors, going for checkbook diplomacy, going for debt trap diplomacy. So all these aspects are to be combated through Sagar, security and growth for all. Then he talked about the Big Bang reforms. The Big Bang reforms for which a stable and strong government was required. Reforms like GST, direct benefit transfer, Jan Dhan Aadhaar, and basically this is your JAM Trinity. Jan Dhan, Aadhaar and mobile. Then going for startups, India hosting more than 100 unicorns. The Insolvency and Bankruptcy Court, which solved the exit problem of corporations and industry. Then he talked about bureaucracy or the civil servants. He said the bureaucracy instilled courage to bring these Big Bang reforms. And my bureaucracy, my crores of hands and feet who work to reform, perform and transform. So this is the core theme of civil services these days. Then every decision that the government is going forward, any government policy, any notification, any act, any amendment, the idea is nation first at all times. Now, he talked about the reforms in the ministries. So, Ministry of Skill was created. Why? To create a skilled demography. So, we cannot reap the benefit of demographic dividend without skilling. So, if we look at the models of South Korea going for more than 95% of skilled workforce. So, we must also skill our demography, maybe partially skilled, maybe fully skilled, maybe taking skill courses, taking bridge courses, or going for upskilling, reskilling. So all those aspects under Ministry of Skill. Then Ministry of Jal Shakti. Why? Because over the period of time, we are seeing that the per capita drinking water and the allocation of water to agriculture, they are conflicting to each other. Why? Because almost 89% of the water usage of India is going towards agriculture. And we are seeing with burgeoning population, the per capita availability of water is decreasing when we see from 1950. And therefore, the ideas of conservation of water as well as giving tap water, clean drinking water to all households becomes a priority. And therefore, merging multiple ministries and departments to create the Ministry of Jal Shakti. Then the idea of Ayush, and therefore inculcated in Ministry of Ayush to mainstream yoga, unani, siddha, rogpa, and the wisdom of holistic healthcare, the wisdom of preventive healthcare, the ideas of going for better lifestyles and a due exercise regime. Then going for Ministry of Fisheries. Why? Because we have to find new green shoots. We have to find green shoots for development of agriculture, whether it is value addition, whether we are talking about animal husbandry, whether we are talking about our coastal regions, utilizing our beaches, utilizing our coastline, or when we are talking about the inland fisheries. All of this helps not only in adding value to agriculture, but it also helps in nutritional security of India and diversifying India's food bowl or food plate. Then the ideas of cooperative ministry. Why? Because we need a cooperative revolution. Revolutions which happened on lines of Amul in animal husbandry, in milk. Now we are creating these producer cooperative organizations or agriculture cooperatives, or basically merging a lot of small farmers together in groups so that they can have larger say when they negotiate with, let's say, private sector, or when they sell their produce. So to create cooperative not only in agriculture but also to create these cooperatives in all sectors of agriculture, right? Then he also talked about the achievements in the form of 100 lakh crores of funding going to states, which was 10 years ago it was around 30 lakh crores. Then 3 lakh crore directly going to Panchayati Raj institutions for grassroots level development. Then talking about the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana with 4 lakh crores of allocation. Then urea bags, which cumulatively cost 10 lakh crores to the government, and the market rate is 3,000 while it is being provided for 300. Then the Mudra Yojana. Why? For self-employment. So it is a credit-based self-employment where Kishore Shishu loans are given. Then the Atmanirbhar package where the MSMEs were giving breathing space. Then one rank, one pension to give the soldiers their due. Then PM Swanidhi scheme to look after the street vendors, more particularly during COVID and post-COVID. And then the Vishwakarma Yojana, which has been launched very recently in a cabinet meeting after the speech. So in the Vishwakarma Yojana is for craftsmen, and to again give them credit so that they can go for self-employment. Then PM Kisan Samman Nidhi. Here the idea is to go for direct benefit transfer to all farmers of India. Then the Jal Jeevan Mission to ensure water to every household. The way Awas Yojana looks for housing, similarly Jal Jeevan Mission looks at water, drinking water. Then the Ayushman Bharat Yojana, which gives insurance, medicine, treatment, as well as linkages to top level of hospitals. And more importantly, the idea of out-of-pocket expenditure when we are talking about medicines. So going for generic drug stores in the name of Jan Aushadhi Kendras. Now all of these individual points can become a prelim question, right? And taken cumulatively, they can become part of, let's say, a way forward in any answer, where we have to we have to substantiate the developmental measures, or we have to look at the developmental measures for vulnerable sections. Then he talked about 75,000 Amrit Sarovars. Now, this is essentially going for 75 Amrit Sarovar in every district. What is the idea? The idea is decentralized storage of water. So again, water storage is the fulcrum. Then providing electricity to 18,000 unconnected villages. Then Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana for massifying bank accounts. Then Swachh Bharat Mission to mainstream the idea of cleanliness as well as make India ODF free. Then the idea of vaccination in form of 200 crore vaccination, and this has become a case study for the entire globe. Then we have already rolled out 5G in more than 700 districts, and we are also working towards 6G. Then we have already achieved the 20% target of ethanol blending. Now, mind you, the Prime Minister was also highlighting that many of these yojana have been completed before time. So now the typical stereotype that we associate with government and government programs is that government is troubled with red tape, bureaucracy, and it is going slow and there is too much of leakages. But with DBT, timelines, and with Aadhaar, what is happening that majority of these schemes which are citizen centric or which are mega schemes, let's say infrastructure, so with time what has happened is that leakages have decreased and the time, either it is on time or before time. So majority of these schemes are before time and they are able to achieve their targets, and therefore the targets are also set exponentially. So even if we are not able to achieve the true target, but still we are able to go ahead of the previous targets. Then the ideas of infrastructure development in form of Parvatmala, Bharatmala, Sagarmala, Urja Ganga. So Urja Ganga goes for your gas pipelines. Then the ideas of aspirational district and aspirational block. Why? Because in some districts and blocks of India, there was high incidence of poverty. And so going ahead with the ideas of sustainable development goals, targeted operation of these individual aspects is being taken in these aspirational districts as well as blocks. Then there was talk about India's character, how India's character must be built. The first aspect is India's unity. So unity is primordial. Then India should focus on excellence, and he gave the example of zero defect and zero effect. So if the world looks at an Indian product, they should trust India. They should trust the manufacturing processes, these services of India. They should trust any produce that is coming from India or any talent that is coming from India for its quality. Then the idea of inclusive development also includes women. And without full participation of the women workforce, no development can be called inclusive. Then the idea of regional aspirations. So different regions of India will have different aspirations and different ideas of development. And therefore, regional disparity or economic divides which are present on space. Let's take the example of, let's say, coastal Maharashtra versus Vidarbha. So what do we want? Do we want the coastal Maharashtra only to develop? No. We want interior regions of India also to develop. Then the idea of national character building as we are moving forward in this Amrit Kal. Then he talked about three evils. The first being the corruption, which is eating India from within as a termite. Then he talked about nepotism and dynastic politics, which has snatched away the rights of ordinary Indians, as well as appeasement, which has affected the true harmonious national character. Now, the second article pertains to your GS2, and this is nothing but the speech, the address that the Chief Justice of India, Dr. D.Y. Chandrachud, gave before the Supreme Court Bar Association. Now, why this is important? Because he touched upon what the judiciary ought to do going forward. And he also used a lot of fodder material, which can be beneficial for your exams. Now, let's look at it. So, he talked about the greatest challenges for Indian judiciary. So he was talking about the first point that he mentioned was barriers to accessible justice. Now, what do we mean by justice? It is to be fair. It is to be reasonable to any individual. But if I'm not able to access, let's say I want to cite my case in a court, but I do not know the process. I'm not able to approach, or I have language issues, or there are some barriers because of cost. So what happens? My access is denied. If access is denied, no matter how strong an institution is, no matter how old an institution is, if the access is denied, what happens? It affects the justice delivery also, right? So he talked about procedural barriers. Procedural barriers, let's say there are different layers of approaching a court. So multiplicity of layers, and that too, each of these layers are complex and they are charged with complex legal jargons. Then about substance. So the idea of whether I will get justice or not, and whether I will get that justice in a timely manner or not, and whether it will be free from any bias or not. So the confidence on the institution is also important. Then he talked about opaque systems. So an ordinary citizen is not able to understand the Victorian English that is used in these courts, the higher courts particularly, and only people who are having good amount of knowledge as well as money. So the privileged class are only able to go through these opaque systems, and language naturally is a barrier. Why? Because we are a diverse country. And if the judgments are, let's say, only in English, maybe all of us do not know English. If the judgments are only in a certain language, maybe all of us do not understand that language, or we are not able to read that language, or we are not able to comprehend after reading because of the complexity of the words or the jargons that are used in these judgments, right? And most of all, these judgments can be as big as 1,000 pages. So a constitutional case can easily be 1,000 pages, and it can run to 1,500 pages very easily. Then the idea of inclusive and accessible, being inclusive and accessible to the last person in the line. Now in the ideals of, let's say, public interest litigation, PIL, by Justice Bhagwati. What was the idea? The idea was opening up the highest court of India to the ordinary citizen. So anyone could write a letter and go for a grievance settlement or point out a matter which is of public importance. So it had opened up the court. But over the period of time, what happened to PIL? Now it has become publicity interest litigation. Yes, that is a good criticism. Then there is huge power distance. So the CJI was referring to the judges sitting at a higher pedestal than the rest. The ideas of the Aristotle's notions of justice, where the judges are sitting at a higher pedestal. Now what happens is, this creates the my baap culture also, and it also leads to power distance, and most importantly, it creates fears. That the judges are to be feared, the legal system is to be feared. So the inclusive and accessible nature of judiciary and the entire legal system requires that these power distance, any substantial, procedural, or even in the architecture, if we see, those things have to reform over the period of time. And then it has to become cost effective. Why? Because anyway, who is going as a litigant is usually facing the might of the state. Why? The state is the largest litigator. It has more than 50% of the cases is against the state. So if the might of state is on other side, and let's say someone is aggrieved party, and the cost is a barrier, the language is a barrier, the procedure is barrier, then what happens? Usually we tend to avoid the courts, and that is travesty of justice, right? Now, he also suggested what is the way forward, what ought to be done. So first of all, the ideas of going for a humane approach, human-centric approach. Again, we the people at the core, the betterment, the benefit of the society at large. So, involving empathy, going for reformation rather than retribution, going for more compassion towards citizen. And by compassion, that means, let's say, giving more time, let's say going for faster decisions. Then he talked about citizens, how citizens look at court. So they do not see the court as a place only to get relief, as a place to adjudicate the decisions, but they also see the courts as a part of democratic institution. So let's say my work is not being done by, let's say, a public officer or a public functionary, then I am approaching the court. Whether or not I will get the relief is not certain, but at least I have the democratic space of pointing my problems out, right? So citizens may or may not get relief, but this democratic space must be enlarged. Then he talked about embracing technology to bridge these divides. So technology like the e-courts project, which recently got 7,000 crores of funding in its third phase. So the ideas of, let's say, live streaming or going for paperless courts, going for software so that one court can easily transfer all the documents in digital form. So digital transfer of documents rather than going for voluminous files, we are going for full digitization. And this digitization is not only top down. So these experiment and the first projects started with the top. Now they will go to the trial levels, the trial stages. And this also includes the skilling of the litigants, the lawyers, as well as the judges. Then he talked about strengthening institutions. So a public functionary may be very good. Then another public functionary may not be doing his or her job. But if there is institutional credibility and if the processes, the inbuilt processes are strong and which has withstood the time, then the institutions will survive and naturally all the people will do justice to their office. But they must also abide the constitutional limits. They cannot go beyond the constitutional limits. So, independence in your own sphere of governance and strengthening of these institutions. Then he asked all the judges and lawyers to inspire confidence in the independence and integrity of the legal processes. If the independence is affected or the integrity is challenged or compromised, then what happens? The trust erodes. And our Prime Minister was also talking about the trust. And the CJI was also talking about institutions. So if the trust on the institution of Supreme Court and High Courts and all courts, if that increases, what happens? As a citizen, I have more access to justice, right? Then he also outlined that efforts of translating judgments is being taken care of to Indian languages. Then he asked to improve the quality of judgment overall. Why? Because whenever we are talking about reasoned decision, So reasoned decision is the way forward. So whenever a decision is made, the reasoning must be very clear, right? Then restraint in conduct. Why? Because we live in the era of social media. We live in a hyper connected world. So restraint in conduct of judges as well as lawyers, it helps in decreasing the biases, the cognitive biases, and this helps in going for sound decision making processes. Furthermore, he requested all the parties of the legal process to encourage more dialogue, whether in courts or outside courts, so that the democratic space is increased. Now, the third topic pertains to the drug pandemic that is going on in the Kashmir Valley. Now, why this is in news is because we have seen an increased prevalence of drugs, and this is post abrogation of Article 370, that we have gone for these de-addiction centers, and we have witnessed some new trends. Now, what do we mean by drugs? So, drug is any unnatural substance which helps in some kind of hallucination, or it is any psychotropic substance which affects our physiology as well as psychology. Now, in this context, let's look at the findings. So 90% of all users of drugs in Kashmir Valley, they are young men, and the median age is only 28 years, right? So these are young men who are now addicted to drugs. Now, one reason that is attributed is that due to the culture, alcohol is considered an anathema. Why? Because majority of the population in Kashmir Valley, they do not consume alcohol. So an alternate in form of drugs. Furthermore, the prevalence of heroin, because it is a border state, as a coping and recreational mechanism. Now, what we have seen in the recent times is that cannabis was the more preferred route. Why? Because these are hill states. So in hill states, so cannabis was planted, maybe illegally, right? Over the period of time, what happened is that Kashmir has remained in conflict, and during this time of conflict, there was more abuse of pharmaceuticals. So going for painkillers. But now, post 2010, they have shifted to opioids and hard drugs. So when we are talking about opioids, we are talking about heroin, and we are also talking about synthetic drugs or lab created drugs as well as opioids. Now, why do we see these new trends? So first reason is the golden crescent. So the proximity with Iran, Pakistan, who are essentially the masters of drug cultivation and drug trade. Furthermore, lack of recreation in society. Good example is that we never had movie theaters. Then sports. Then frequent shutdowns. Let's say called by the Hurriyat Conference or the separatist. Then fewer jobs. Why? Whenever there is conflict, what happens? The corporations, they will always avoid conflict areas. They will never reach out to these areas because the investments are not safe. And financial stress. If we do not have job, Yet we have a big family and there is regular conflict due to which there are frequent shutdowns. Then what will happen to our livelihood? So livelihood will be affected, leading to financial stress. Then whenever we are in a conflict zone, good example is the Burhan Wani case. So Burhan Wani encounter led to shutdown for months. Then let's say post abrogation of Article 370. So recent examples, say during COVID also. So if we continuously face such shocks, what happens? Finance is affected and therefore livelihood is affected. Therefore quality of life is affected and therefore daily sustenance becomes difficult. So what happens? A lot of stresses. Then let's say there is conflict in society. So someone is going to join, let's say, terrorism. Then that person is killed in an encounter. So what will happen to the family? What happens to the neighbor? And what happens to the mass in general? So stresses increase, right? And due to which such population becomes an easy target for international drug syndicates. And it has been a strategy of Pakistan to pump in drugs, weapons through border states. Why? Because it helps them earn money to fuel more terrorism. Now, these are border states, and we have recently seen that there are drone shipments which are coming in. So these are one of the reasons. Then the easy accessibility of heroin. What we are witnessing is that post abrogation of Article 370, terrorism, overground workers, OGWs, and the entire ecosystem, they have vanished from Kashmir Valley, but they have recently shifted to Jammu Valley. And the topography of Jammu is similar to Punjab, except for few hilly regions. So the lower reaches of Jammu is more plains, and we also have lots of rivers crisscrossing the borders. So these regions become easy target of infiltration. And if there is a good supply chain of heroin coming from Golden Crescent, and more so originating from Pakistan, or let's say Afghanistan, or let's say Iran. But if the supply chain is very good, then what happens? It is easily consumed and distributed in the society. Now let's look at the Forest Right Act. Why is it in the news? Because recently debate has happened on the allocation of Forest Rights Act in UT of J&K. Now what was the need of Forest Rights Act? So it is to allay the historical injustice of tribes and other forest dwellers. So tribes and forest dwellers which are living in the forested areas, they were never given title rights. That means I am living in a particular area, forested area, for more than 30 years, 50 years, 70 years, or my entire 5 generations of family, they have lived in a particular jungle, but I am not the owner of a single inch of land. So issue of title rights, what we call as patta. So the idea is to undo this historical injustice, and the name says Rights Act. Now, who are involved here? So forest dwelling scheduled tribes. So only the scheduled tribes which are dwellers of forest, and other traditional forest dwellers. So not all the forest dwellers are scheduled tribes. So if there are other traditional forest dwellers which are living and residing in the forest, so their rights, their historical injustice has to be undone. So we are vesting rights. What form of rights? So individual rights as well as community rights. And post independence, what happened? That land reforms were carried out in the entire India, giving out land tenure, giving security of land, giving title. So all those things have not happened in the forested regions, and therefore the livelihood and food security and the entire life of these families are at stake. Let's say there is a developmental project due to which what happened, multiple tribal communities and forest dwellers, they were resettled. They had to be resettled. Let's say creation of a dam. So after not giving title rights, their displacement has also happened. Now this leads to what? This leads to alienation with the state or possible conflict with the state. Now we must appreciate that in India, the forested regions, the mineral regions, the tribal regions, they coincide, or there is a very big overlap between these three regions. And if we superimpose the map of left-wing extremism with these three regions, then we'll see that majority of the LWE areas are also tribal regions, mineral regions, and forested regions. Therefore, to decrease the alienation from the state and also to undo the historical injustice, we brought the Forest Rights Act in 2006. So it involves your title rights. So title rights you can get up to 4 hectares only if you have lived, your family has lived for more than 75 years or 3 generations successively. And no new, let's say I'm living there only 50 years, or let's say after the act has come, I went to forest, so I will not get the title. Then you have some community rights, some producer rights, where you have access to minor forest produce. So rights are in form of, let's say, using water, using forest resources. It is not about felling of trees, but it is about using the minor forest produce. Let's say some bark, let's say some grass, leaves, twigs, all those things. Then there is rehabilitation right. So even if you have been removed from the place, you have been displaced, but this act provides in situ rehabilitation. That means you will be again rehabilitated in your own region rather than some new region or some new city. So in situ rehabilitation of displaced persons evicted without compensation. When simply evicted due to a developmental project, you are bound to get your rights again. Then management of forest. Now there are 2 ways of looking at forest management. One is a top-down approach where, let's say, you as an officer will manage all the forest. The other way is going for people's participation. So if I am a forest dwelling community and I am living in the forest, then it is my natural tendency, it is but natural that I will also conserve forest as well as the biodiversity. So it also reposes faith in form of forest management rights on these forest dwellers. Now, the Gram Sabha becomes very important in this act. Why? Because the Gram Sabha initiates the process of giving the individual rights or the community rights. Let's say community rights like grazing land or minor forest produce, and individual rights like title or ownership of the land, right? Now, what is the process? So the Gram Sabha will initially pass a resolution recommending those rights, and these resolutions will go to the subdivision and finally to the district level. But there are issues. Issues is that while the Gram Sabha may have recommended a lot of these titles, so discrepancy is there in the recommendations of Gram Sabha. Furthermore, there are issues of favoritism also. Then at the level of block and district, it is seen that there is pendency. And furthermore, while the titles, the individual rights are granted more easily, community rights, they are not granted, right? They are rarely granted. Now, in this regard, we must appreciate what is the significance of this move. So, A, it gives title. So, your property. So now you can build a house. You can go for development of your land. Then it empowers the grassroots democracy. So let's assume that this region also suffers from left-wing extremism. Let's take a block of, let's say, Bastar. So let's say we are in the Bastar highlands of Chhattisgarh. So if the Gram Sabha starts giving title rights, starts recommending for title rights to all the traditional dwellers, then what will happen? The institution's trust becomes more important. It increases. And as trust in these institutions, as trust in any institution of the state increases, so the trust on the Naxals, that erodes, that corrodes. And so what happens? So the people who were alienated earlier, they become closer to the state. So it is also a form of conflict management and conflict resolution when we talk about left-wing extremism or Naxal movement. Then it also helps in preservation of forest plus biodiversity. Because we are seeing case studies from multiple national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, that tribes have conserved communities. Good example is Pakke Tiger Reserve. Where the local community has preserved tigers as well as hornbills. Right? Then development in tribal regions. Now, the Prime Minister was also referring to the aspirations as well as the regional disparities. So when we are talking about aspirational district program, aspirational blocks, we are essentially bridging what? Regional disparity. The gap of development between the developed regions of India and the underdeveloped. So we have to bridge the disparity and we have to appreciate the aspirations. And the tribal districts, regions where tribes are more in number, there is prevalence of tribes, there is prevalence of minerals, there is prevalence of forest. What do we see? We see some key factors that the development is somehow lagging in these regions. Then it also prevents exploitation. Why? Because we are empowering the community, we are empowering the Gram Sabha, we are empowering the forest dwellers, we are empowering the tribes. So will they take care of their lands? Naturally. So it prevents exploitation. Why? Because more rights are given to the Gram Sabha. And most importantly, it also protects the culture and the cultural landscape to say so. Now we take the case study moving forward of Odisha. Now Odisha has gone for implementation of Forest Right Act. So if there are any questions on Forest Right Act, we can use this case study. So 22% of population of Odisha is under scheduled tribe category. Now what they have done is they have created an atlas in 2019 to study potential forest land. Then they went for 3% of community forest rights, 3% of land for community forest rights and 32% for individual forest rights. And they submitted this to Union Ministry of Tribal Affairs. Now today Odisha is leading in form of Forest Right Act implementation, given that it has approved more than 5 lakh individual forest right claims. That simply means 5 lakh people got title rights. So this can serve as a very good case study going forward. Thank you so much. I hope it helped.